It's now my pleasure to turn over the podium to Paul Fish and Suzanne Fish, who are going to talk about the field schools in the Tucson Basin.
Thank you, Barbara, for doing that. Paul was going to do that so that everyone could see the other author of this presentation. I'm doing this one, and he's going to present for us in the panel discussion in December. So I'm going to talk about Tucson archaeology through time. You can't hear? Pardon?
Move it up.
Move it up, okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Good, okay. I'm going to talk about a parallel tradition of field schools. These are non-residential. They are based at the University of Arizona during the regular semester schedule. And because of that, they have a certain different flavor and some different purposes. And also I'm going to try to hit the highlights of 30 years of these alternative field schools. So I'm going to move pretty fast through what they have consisted of. I would like to mention that these field schools were always in partnership with the Arizona State Museum in many ways, including our major employment, our primary base in the university. They were Tucson focused, all within reach of the university, going out on a daily basis. And there were multiple class formats. All of these represent anthropology classes during the regular semester. The one was called Anthropology 304, and it was a somewhat shorter exposure to field work. And then there were two other classes, 442 and 542, that were extended periods and had as much field exposure as the residential field schools, but stretched out in a semester. Okay. Well, 30 years of alternative kinds of field school meant a lot of scrambling for funding over the years. Field schools are expensive, and so we combined every possible source of funding over time, and it worked pretty well. Sometimes we didn't know where the money was coming from next year, but it always worked out. We had many collaborators of different sorts. In some cases, we're naming people. In some cases, we're just naming institutions. We have not named everyone here that we worked with, but these are acknowledgments for major kinds of contributions, in some cases co-teaching the field schools and advising and so forth. So these are the highlights of collaborators. Okay, because we were based in Tucson, there was a large part of outreach for these field schools. And in fact, I think that was a real advantage to students, in that the students in these field schools learned how to work with older people, with school children, with many organizations. So particularly we had Earth Watch sessions in conjunction with some of them, non-traditional UA students, Pima Community College. We had high school classes, and this is an example of a separate but related project by the Archaeological and Historical Society that was in conjunction with our work at Tumamoc Hill. So lots of outreach, lots of collaboration. Okay, we had tours constantly because we were in Tucson. And I would say that we would average one a week at least, sometimes more. So these are some of the groups that visited us and learned of what Tucson archaeology was like. Many of our visitors were actually other archaeologists, other archaeological students or anthropological students, but they were also the general public and everything in between. I just have a little mention here. I'm not urging anyone to vote in any particular way, but the Pima County bond election open space will save Marana Mound. So, right, Linda? Okay. Right. Okay. We always tried to vary the experiences for the students in our field school because we were based in Tucson. You know, they were not seeing some of the other exotic and exciting archaeology in the rest of our state or in the rest of the region. So we always took trips. And until the recent State Department warnings and need for a passport, we always took students to Mexico. We usually went to Sonora and Chihuahua, and then sometimes we just went to Chihuahua, as well as visiting other parts of the state. Actually, a Mexican tourist magazine captured our field students visiting Casas Grandes. So that was exciting. On those same field trips, we looked at pottery making at modern Mata Ortiz, learned a lot by doing that, bought a lot of pottery. We had visiting lecturers on a very regular basis, mainly from the University of Arizona faculty, but also from CRM professionals, the tribes. Sometimes had representatives giving us lectures, you know, just a whole variety of lectures. At University Indian Ruin, which is our most recent, we had someone every day at lunch, and we could do that because we were based near Tucson. And we visited lots of other projects as we could. And in a couple of cases with deserts, we actually participated with them for short periods. Desert archaeology, excuse me. I'm looking at Bill and using shorthand. Okay. To start out with, in the early 80s, we conducted a very large survey that took 6 years to finish. We did it on and off. The surveyors were always students, and we covered 1,500 square kilometers from the northern Tucson basin up to the Picacho Mountains. That was one boundary, and a boundary over here. And so we could set our further research in that knowledge of what the larger regional settlement pattern was. And in fact, this remains the largest contiguous survey in the Southwest. So that was the setting for what we did afterwards for many years. And we worked with 3 communities, 3 Hohokam multi-site communities within this survey area, and defined them. But the one in which we worked the most was what we call the Marana community, not surprisingly right near the town of Marana. And it spans the Tucson Basin from side to side. These communities are kind of in this general range. This would be not atypical of the 3 that we outlined through survey, about 55 square miles, and including all of the sites in the early classic that were associated with the Marana Mound site. So that was also a setting, and that was gave students during those years a great deal of survey experience. Okay. We had a separate project which was funded separately by NSF and Winter Grant and other kinds of money, but it was intertwined with everything we did in the Marana Hohokam community, and that was to define Hohokam agriculture in the northern Tucson Basin. And this is kind of the product of that, in which we took a cross-section across the Marana community in illustrating this, and can specify the different kinds of agriculture by which they made a living. Irrigation at the Santa Cruz River, irrigation on alluvial fans, floodwater farming on alluvial fans, runoff cultivation of large agave fields, and then intense exploitation of resources, mainly saguaro and other cacti, and then again floodwater farming up at the mountain front. And that was kind of a compendium of what we learned in that research. We were very focused on documenting the cultivation of agave as part of that. It kind of rose up as the most interesting part of that larger project. And that was documenting how in this Marana community agave was actually cultivated, which wasn't well known at the time. We mapped a number of fields. Looks like little dots all over the place, and the little dots are these rock piles in which we did some experimental cultivation in the prehistoric rock piles. And each of these little dots, which were loci of cultivating particular plants, were interspersed with these huge roasting pits up to about 30 meters in diameter, which are the indication of agave processing right in the field areas. So we also were very interested in the scale of agave cultivation, and we had about 2.5 square kilometers within the Marana community. So if these are all the contemporary sites, or more or less contemporary sites in the Marana community, these were all agave cultivation sites, and huge expanses of those rock pile features, and then really smaller ones up against the mountains. Then, sort of at the same time as that was going on, we worked at the Marana platform mound site and looked at the early classics site plan. This is a map, an enigmatic map of melted adobe lumps, which translates into all the compounds, the residential compounds that were at the site. And believe it or not, by mapping carefully and then walking across and recording the further details, we could pretty much tell from the melted adobe at this relatively undisturbed site where the compounds were. And this is Doug Gann's rendition of views of those compound sites as they were interspersed around the mound. And with Doug, our last best count was 42 compounds, from which we estimate a population somewhere near 1,000 people. We looked at a number of the compounds. We had tiered sampling. We collected the surface completely in a systematic way. Then we looked at trash mounds associated with the compounds all the way across the site. Then we began to sample compounds and the platform mound at the center of the site, which was daunting because this residential compound is nearly a football field in size. So we really could not excavate an entire one with all its rooms, but we sampled across the site at those different levels. Some of the major conclusions were that, the compounds were exceptional size and represent a different kind of integration of inhabitants than we see in many of the smaller compounds in other parts of the Hohokam world. And also we were very pleased to see a very intense craft production at the mound site itself, which we compared to outlying sites which also had craft production, but at a much less intensity than at the mound site itself. So in this assemblage from one floor, there's tools for pottery manufacture, for textile and fiber manufacture, and a lot of evidence for shell jewelry manufacture. And that was pretty typical. Almost every structure that we tested or excavated had craft production tools. Okay, so this would be a compound wall with rooms outlined against it, and then there are other ones in the middle. Okay. This is an artist's reconstruction. And actually, should we turn down the lights up here? It seems kind of glary to me. Are you all seeing everything okay? I don't know where the lights are, but anyway, this is an artist's reconstruction of the Marana Mound site, the platform mound, and some of the residential compounds. Thank you, Barney. Yeah. And this is a very, very large room for Hohokam adobe rooms in the Mound compound. So we looked at the mound and the rooms within the compound there as well. Okay. So that takes care of sort of the northern Tucson Basin field schools and activities. And then I'm going to Tumamoc Hill. And when we started work at the top of Tumamoc Hill, which is the road going up and the desert laboratory down here, and then all of the village material is up at the top in a 16-acre summit area. When we started, the story was that this was late Hohokam, and it turned out not to be at all. There was a Cienega phase village that was pre-ceramic, and then a Tortolita phase village, which was in early ceramic times. And we found that out in the course of doing the field school research. And that was our closest commute to the University of Arizona. It only took 15 minutes or so to get there from the museum to the site. Okay. We looked at the villages and the massive walls and terraces around them toward the top of the hill. We did a lot of work with GPS and total stations. So we have the statistics on the massive walls. The students were trained in those technologies which were kind of cutting edge at the time, no longer are. We mapped the Tortolita phase houses to see the village layout. We could not map the Cienega phase structures from surface indications, but we could the Tortolita phase ones because we had these stone foundations for, this is a reconstruction of what most of the houses were like. We also had a few that were rectangular and larger. So this was the recording, and then sitting down and recording too. And we also excavated a small sample of them, establishing in that way that these were much earlier. These were much earlier villages than we had thought before. Okay. Both of the villages used a community room at the center, which gives us kind of a flavor of them being true villages with differentiated structures. This is the Cienega phase community room, cut down 70 centimeters through a hard caliche substrate. And this is a reuse of the same footprint in the Tortolita phase. The final product of this series of years of field schools was a complete map of the village during Tortolita times. At the top, these are the walls around them, walls and terraces, which we think were constructed in the Cienega phase, the earlier pre-ceramic village, which was of course already agricultural. And we think that because we excavated a Cienega pit house that had to be in place after the walls were built. So by this village here, and you can see all the structures, the walls were probably, at least the one wall where we found the pit house, and that stretch on this side of the hill had already been constructed. So if you look at the patterns of the pit houses by mapping them all, we could see that groups of them shared walls, probably were inhabited by people who were closely related because you could kind of hear what everyone else was doing. A majority of the structures shared walls in these clusterings of up to 10 pit houses sharing. And these predate the typical Ho'okam courtyard group. The Archaeological and Historical Society did a related project in which they recorded all of the rock art, the red dots, and the green dots are cupules. Okay. Finally, the final set of field school years were at University Indian Ruin, where you may have seen been on the tours yesterday. This is a very interesting late classic, predominantly late classic, also an early classic, and has a smattering of pre-classic we've just learned. And it's a platform mound site in the Indian Ridge neighborhood. It's right smack in the middle of houses, 13 acres that have been preserved because it was donated to the university. And the striking thing about this is that university field schools worked here in the distant past before World War II, and they left us very few records. So we have some maps of the architecture. We don't have bulk artifacts. We don't have a lot of the information that allows us to interpret it. But you can see there's great variability in the architectural styles. And so we just made a small beginning at trying to work out a little bit more of why that is. Whether some of it is time, some of it is the aggregation of differing groups. Okay, so we did all the surface work and did ground penetrating radar in hopes that we could identify a lot of the other architecture without having to excavate it. Unfortunately, the ground penetrating radar did not work at this site, which is full of terrace gravels. So that was not too successful, but it was great because the students learned how to do it. Okay, so we were trying to look at what is left of research potential where so much has already been done. And so we re-excavated one of the rooms that had been excavated by Byron Cummings in the distant past. And we found that indeed there was a great deal more potential. In fact, there were intact floor features still there. So we don't know if Byron Cummings and his students found an upper floor or simply didn't get down to the floor in some instances. But there's still a lot that can be done with these already excavated rooms. Other highlights were finding and mapping a second, much smaller mound than the large mound that has long been known from Julian Hayden's excavations at University Indian Ruin. This smaller mound, we weren't certain if it was really a mound because it's less than a meter high. We found out that it was. Doug Craig came and worked with us, and I should mention, of course, that Mark Elson has been helping us direct these activities too. But anyway, Doug Craig made the first trench up, and indeed, although it's not high at all, it is a platform mound in that it has a retaining wall that has been filled in, and there are buildings on top. And we do not think that this is a competing mound with the larger mound. It always must have had a singular function, a differentiated function, because it began in the early classic and was remodeled incredibly for the next 250 years. So we think it has this separate character from the larger platform mound at this site, and we were able without excavating a great deal of it to kind of get the plan. That's the platform mound there, and these are attached rooms all around it. Okay. Another highlight of what we found out, and this is a photograph courtesy of Henry Wallace, that we had a very late classic room. We don't know exactly how late. It had external importation of ceramics that have late dates, and to our surprise, it had quite a bit of bison bone. We suspect the bison came from the San Pedro rather than from the Tucson Basin itself, which raises interesting questions about how long bison meat keeps before you no longer want to eat it. This was not dried. We have all sorts of pieces of the skeletal material, and so there's no suggestion this was dried meat. Did they pick up and carry a live one, or what? Okay. And finally, I just wanted to show some of the students who, from the different classes, have published in both these journals and books, monographs, and volume chapters. So I think a real advantage, aside from the experience, has been the opportunity to publish on this material. Okay, thank you.